Coming. I think it's really fantastic that we've got such a packed house for this session. And those of you who are here for my introduction to the conference this morning, this really relates to the whole process that we put our conference together, which is really through consultation with all of you. So now, having been this year, we will be asking you about your thoughts about the 2 days, and we'll be contacting you throughout the year, if you'd like to keep in touch with us, about content that you think that we need to cover in future Communicate events, both big and small. And as we ran workshops across the country this year, we kept hearing about this theme of storytelling, and so many people saying we really want to have more and more creative and different discussions about storytelling. And in some ways we thought, isn't that what we've been talking about at Communicate for 14 years? But then we realized this is really at the heart of what we're all trying to do. So we've invited our panel today, who all come from really different backgrounds, as you have probably read in the paperwork, and will come in to hear those stories. So I hope that they'll give us a bit of inspiration and different kind of way to approach this key thing we're all trying to do around storytelling. So just about format, I'm going to give each of them, I've asked them to give us some thoughts for 10 minutes each. We'll take a couple of questions between each, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion with our panel, but more importantly with all of you. People sitting near there, if you get too hot, feel free to open the door. We're going to start off, and I'm going to hand straight over to Sid.
Hi everyone. So, is this the, do I press this? Is that right? There we go. Cool, so thanks for asking me to come and talk to you a little bit today. So, effective storytelling, I call it telling good stories. So, a little bit about my story. I moved to Bristol 25 years ago to attend Barashton, the art college, and soon decided that I wanted to stay in Bristol. It's a cool city, and it's got this brilliant DIY sensibility, and there's loads of creative, like-minded people. So I stayed here and set up a couple of businesses 20 years ago actually, because it was work. So I set up a small chain of restaurants called Tiny Cafe. How many of you guys are from Bristol? Yeah. So I'm no longer working at the Tiny Cafe, but I founded it and worked for it for 15 years. And I also set up an events company, and so we organise a festival, Sharma Festival. Has anyone been to Sharma? Yeah. Okay. So people know of what I do, which is good or bad, from the experience of it. We also organise a much smaller family-focused event called Starry Skies, and we're just launching a new event called Kin at the Arnolfini in a few weeks' time. So so obviously a lot of you here are marketing and communication professionals. So for me, the word story is sort of interchangeable to a campaign or launching a brand. So yeah, it's a bit of a mark-on sort of terminology. So some rules I sort of follow when I tell my stories is obviously they've got to be genuine, and you've got to believe in them. They've got to be sort of heartfelt. I never sell anything that I wouldn't want to buy myself. They have to be credible. In the world that we live in now, where we've got so much information being bombarded at us through social media and stuff, you know, they've got to be truthful. They've got to be backed by some sort of science, and they've got to be better than the stories that you're trying to, you know, the dominant stories of the time. No one's going to join your story if the story that's already there is better than the one you're trying to tell. So, for Shambhala, for instance, our strapline is Adventures in Utopia. It's called purposeful hedonism. And so we sort of say, look, you can have an amazing party, you can come to our festival, you can have the time of your life, but actually you won't be wrecking the planet. It won't be one of these festivals that you see on TV where there's 30,000 tents being left behind. And so when we tell a story, the challenge we have is that story then has to be true when you reach one of our events or the restaurant, whatever it may be. It's got to be authentic all the way from the beginning of the story to the person experiencing that story. So, Shambhala, for instance, we the whole event is run on renewable energy. We ban single-use plastic. We have reusable serveware. We offset all our travel emissions for public and crew. And in 2016, we decided to go meat and fish free. And so that was quite a challenging story to put across in our pre-event comms. So what people hate being told is what they can't do in life. We live in such a consumerist society that we're told we can do what we want, eat what we want, choose what we want whenever we want it, and it doesn't matter what those effects on the planet are. So we had to think, right, okay, this story's going to be about giving more rather than taking away. So we had to scour the UK for the best vegetarian, vegan stalls. We had to present delicious, affordable, tasty menus. And we also had to provoke. So we didn't know what a sustainable plate of food looks like. So we invited a lady that hunted and killed her own meat. She lived in Scotland and she was hunting grey squirrel. And so we had like grey squirrel satay kebabs on offer, which wasn't very particularly, didn't go well with the vegan society, I must admit. We also had an insect cafe. So, it's all right to present stories that provoke people, and that's part of a debate. It's sort of, it's all right to have a two-way engagement process with your audiences. And was it successful? Yes. When we did post-event questionnaires, 50% of the meat eaters said they actually cut down on their meat, and then 7 months on, we went back to those people, and 24% of them said they were still sustaining a low intake of their meat. So, that was a good story that was presented well and executed well. Coming back to the Thali Cafe, the Thali Cafe was always an egalitarian type of restaurant. When we first opened, there was no menu. Everyone had the same food, and it was £5. And we tried to use as much seasonal produce as possible. So we thought, right, let's extend this to a takeaway scheme. And we looked to India to find a story that would fit in to the narrative that the Thali Cafe was all about. And so we quickly found the tiffins. I don't know if anyone knows about tiffins, but they're sort of reusable, stackable pots, and wives and mothers would make home-cooked food for people that worked in the city of Mumbai from the suburbs, and they'd be distributed by these guys here called dabawalas. And so dabawalas, actually, many of them were literate, so they used these coloured coded signs and stuff on the top of the tiffins, and they would get the tiffins to the city from the suburbs every day, and there'd be up to nearly 500,000 of these pots, and they would end up at the right office desk and come back home. Oh, sorry. Has anyone heard anything I've said? So we thought, what a great story, and it was a story that resonated with our audience and our customers. And I think there's about 25,000 tiffins now in Bristol homes. So one of our newer events was Starry Skies, and we thought, right, let's, as we all became parents and we go more of our sort of hedonistic lifestyles, we thought, right, let's organise an event that, is a more rustic childhood. The one sort of I had, when I used to come home from school, I used to go straight to the playing fields, and I'd never come back until it was dinner time. And unfortunately for my kids, now they come home and they're sort of directly on the screens. Even though I try and prize their iPads away from them, it's quite a hard job to do. So, the story there was let the kids roam free, and that's how we sold it in our marketing comms. And it was funny, so when day one happened of the first event, you had some parents saying, look, my child's been missing for 20 minutes and I don't know where they are. And we'd sort of say, okay, look, I don't think it's a problem, we'll start looking for them. And obviously they'd be there, hiding under some sort of bracken. And by day two, you'd see the same parents and you'd say, well, where are these kids? Oh, we haven't seen them for 6 hours. But it's fine. So stories about childhood and how you present them in marketing are really key. But if they resonate, then they're really powerful. Our new event, Kin, that I just mentioned a bit, it's got narrative at the heart of it. And so we're asking these questions, and we've got quite billboards, massive billboards out across the city at the moment. Asking these questions. This is one example. The other one is, should we wait for the collapse before we rebuild? And
Kin it's a story about kindness, and someone asked me the other day, who inspired you most to put Kin on? And I said, well, it was Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, because these guys are telling stories that are the opposite of the story that I want to tell. I want to tell a story about empathy and compassion. I don't want to tell a story about isolation and protectionism. And so Kin is going to be a live story-making event where you've got there'll be a blur between the audience and the presenters, and together people are going to start shaping a different kind of narrative that we'll then put out through our sort of channels post-event. Obviously, to tell a story, you need an audience, and that sounds quite obvious, and it is, but it's also, getting an audience develops over time. For Shambhala, we've been doing that event for 20 years, and you have to be able to listen to criticism and follow their feedback. Not all the time, because they're not always right. But once you get a trust from your audience, your stories are so powerful because that trust is the traction to get your story far and wide. So it's a little bit about me and stories.
Thank you so much, Sid. Just because we're going to keep changing gear, I'm keen to just see if there's a couple of comments or questions hearing about stories and events.
Can I just say thank you? It sounded great and really inspiring.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I think we should leave it there then. Fantastic. Okay, we will keep moving, but all of our panelists are going to be here for a discussion after. So I'm going to hand over to Leila.
Hi, I'll use this one. Okay. Hello everyone, thanks for having me here. My name is Leila Segal and I run Voice of Freedom, which is an organisation that works with trafficked women. We run participatory photography workshops in which women who've been trafficked have the opportunity to create photographs and texts and tell their stories directly to the world. Participatory photography is a well-established discipline that many practitioners are now using, and I don't know if there are people here who are familiar with it as a technique for storytelling, but my intention today is to suggest to you that your organisations may potentially benefit from using this technique. The image that you can see up on the screen, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later, is one image created on the project by one of the women on the project. So, the way that participatory photography is powerful is through stimulating empathy and emotion in the viewers. And it's very easy for us, if we're talking to an individual, to feel moved by somebody's story. It's easy to engage emotionally, and it's easy to become active as a result of what we feel. What is much harder is to move people in relation to large groups that may be on the other side of the world experiencing unimaginable trauma. So the work that we do with individual women creating photographic stories accompanied by texts in their own words has the power to move people because individual women from their own perspective are telling stories. A couple of examples of where this work is now being used. So Amnesty International in London has used work by women on our project to highlight the issue of trafficking in the Sinai through the torture camps. And another of our partners, Anti-Slavery International, has used work created by trafficked women on our project for its victim protection campaign, campaigning for better rights and conditions for trafficked people in the UK. It's extraordinary to me that a woman who has been in the Sinai, in what is known as the torture camps, is now having her voice heard in one of the most influential forums in the world, Amnesty International. And this method, which seems to be very simple, which is that you have a group of people from a marginalised, disenfranchised, issue-affected group, as the jargon has it, you give them cameras, you run workshops, usually the programme lasts for about 2 weeks intensively. You encourage them to think about the issues, you do structured exercises, and at the end of that, a powerful body of very communicative material is produced. And I haven't got time, unfortunately, to go into the details of how it works. If I just flag up to you participatory photography, I'll be happy to give more details afterwards if anyone wants to talk to me. There's plenty of material available online. I'm going to just highlight a couple of parts of the process which are really key to its effectiveness. The first one is the integrity of the creative process. When we work with these women, ethics are everything. So we adhere to models of participatory practice that facilitate control by the participants, and this is really, really key. So we are used to seeing images which are created about vulnerable people. We're not so used to seeing images that are created by those people themselves, that put the point of view firmly in their perspective. But the participatory model is designed to place control in the hands of the people who've had the experiences themselves. So we, as facilitators, create a space, they fill the space, they decide what they want to say and how they want to say it. So I'd like to give you, before I move on, just to talk about this image. This was created by Desta Gitane. She's from Ethiopia, and she went through the Sinai torture camps. I worked with her and other women in Israel where she had found refuge in a safe house. So when you first look at this, you may think it's shocking and even exploitative, really, because it's so graphic and it shows her in a position of humiliation. But the key to understanding the difference in this image is that Desta herself made the decision to communicate exactly this experience. It's a self-portrait. She set up the shot herself, she directed it herself, and then she wrote, or in fact she spoke, the words which I'll read to you about the image. Refugees who pass through this experience are really different. Although we are human beings and we have our bodies on us, the people who pass through the process are really new. They have a different personality, though they look the same. Of course, I'm not ashamed of having been trafficked. There are so many people who are ashamed of it and don't want to tell the story, but I'm not. People have to learn from this experience, and I'll tell it. With these few pictures and what will be written on them, other people can potentially learn. So I think that it's very clear, her voice is very clear, and her authorship is very clear in these materials. So I wish that I had more time, but I don't. I'd like to highlight the other part of the process I think is crucial really to the integrity of the work, and that's informed consent. So no material from our workshops is ever shown without the informed consent of its author. And we build this into the process from the very first workshop, when we start encouraging the women to think of their work as owned by them, and to think of themselves as the authors who have control of the work. By the end of the workshop process, each woman is in a position to sit down with all of her photographs and all of her text and to make a decision about how she wants to portray herself to the world. So she will choose which images are made public, and we will not exhibit anything that doesn't have her consent. And she will also decide which parts of her experience she would rather remain private. So that is really fundamental to the process, and I'd encourage you, if any of you are starting to think how this might work for your clients or your interest groups, to really look into proper training and to look into learning about participatory practice and the ethics of that process. So now, I'm just going to move through a few images so that you can see the scope of this work without any text. These are all created by women on the project. As you can see, no woman is visually identified, and that's a really important part of the work as well. We focus on issues, concepts and ideas, and that makes it very different from some of the voyeuristic intrusions into the lives of vulnerable people that I think we may be used to seeing in advertising and fundraising campaigns. And I'd like to finish by reading you the text that goes with this image, because I think it's such a great example of the power and also the subtlety of the participatory process. This image was created by Tizalu Brahan. She's Ethiopian, and she was also trafficked through the Sinai torture camps. She took the picture at the safe house in Israel, where she had found refuge. And these are her words to go with it. This is my room. I took this picture because I always like to see it. This is the first place I was happy after they stole me and I didn't see my father again. Thank you.
Any comments or react over to Matt?
Fantastic afternoon, everyone. Next time you find yourself in an event where they're sort of serving drinks in these polystyrene cups, what I want you to do is just put them bottom to bottom like this, and then get a little bit of tape and just tape them together. The other thing you need is a broken elastic band. Now the thing is, when people look at this, they just look at rubbish. I look at this as a flying machine. Let me show you. So if you were to wrap this round once, wrap it round twice, you've got a catapult. And the front row's getting a bit nervous at this point. So I'll show you that again. So if you wrap it around once and twice, and then you, as it does it, as it flies, it's got that backspin there. And it's just lovely, isn't it? Now, the thing is, when I do this, the first reaction I get, I work a lot in schools, is that wow reaction. This is my daughter from a few years ago. And then, particularly me as a magician, I do something, and then a few seconds later, from the initial wow, you get this. You get the, how does it work, factor. And then, for the reason I wanted to show you this is, there's a third step. What do you think would happen if I got some giant polystyrene cups? And we got two of you sat inside here, and we taped it around, and next thing you know, you're landing in the middle of that. Maybe you're looking at the new future for travel, environmentally friendly travel. We don't need any fuel or something like that. Because the third step is this. Now what do I do with it? Now I wonder what would happen if. So for me, my job as a science communicator, and like I said, mainly working in schools, I work through this process. The wow, that's amazing. How does it work? Now what can I do with it? Or now I wonder what would happen. And then that leads to more wows and more hows and more hows. But increasingly I'm finding myself, and particularly the sort of tension there with the magician, is I like to almost circumnavigate the how. So I do a bit of explanation, but for me the real main emphasis is on the wow and the now stage. So this talk I just really want to focus on 3 areas. The first area is that area between the wow and the how. Second area I want to talk a bit about explanations. And the third area is this: how do we go from an explanation on to now what can I do with that? So that's where we're going to look at to start with. So let's first of all talk about this middle ground, this state of knowing and not knowing, because I'd encourage us all as storytellers is to embrace mysteries. Actually, sometimes we're too quick to jump from, actually we face with the mystery, but ha-ha, I know the answer, let me tell you the answer to this, let me give you an explanation. We need to give our audiences time to embrace mysteries, to become comfortable with it, for a number of reasons. First of all, mysteries are intriguing. They engage, they hook an audience in. And so presenting mysteries, we grab their attention. Another reason is this: well, when we're faced by mysteries, mysteries basically shout out, there's more here than you think. It shouts out the question, what else? Actually, if we jump straight to an explanation, we squash out that what else moment. We just go down to one solution. We need to leave time for people to become comfortable with uncertainty, for not knowing. It's a great way of building up resilience if you face mysteries. It's a great way of empowering people. The problem is, if we rush in to give a solution, we effectively disempower them. We think, actually, we don't know, we couldn't work out the answer. So we need space for that growth to become comfortable in the mystery. So that's the first thing I want to share. Just encourage us all to embrace mysteries and to convey mysteries rather than be too quick to give an answer. I love this quote from the author Terry Pritchard. He says, "It doesn't stop being magic just because you know how it works." Well, most of the time. Sometimes when I go to Covent Garden, I see things like this and think, actually, no, actually, you've robbed that illusion by explaining it. So I'm going to slightly paraphrase it or add a bit. It doesn't stop being magical just because you know how something works. So for me, I love taking my daughters to museums. Oxford Natural History Museum, a brilliantly bonkers museum. It's got like the dinosaurs, it's got the sharks, it's got the crocodiles, and in the back of the pit rivers you've got the shrunken heads, you've got the coats made from seal intestines, things like this. I love museums like this. In fact, I thought, let's just have a really quick quiz, okay? So we're in a room full of natural history experts, so I've got an animal here, and I just wondered if you can possibly recognise what this animal is. And bonus points if you get the Latin name for it as well. So let's have a look. What do we make of it? What was it? It's a rabbit, right? Well, lots of people think it's a duck, but no, it's definitely a rabbit. Now, the reason I wanted to show you that is because much as I love going to places like this, much as I love looking at like the skeletons of animals and sort of seeing how they work and the magicalness of explanations, I'm also at the same time, particularly as a father, wrestling with this. This is a quote from the physicist Richard Feynman. He says, "You can know the name of a bird in all the languages of the world, but when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing, whatever, about the bird." I think sometimes with explanations we're too quick to label, aren't we? When we label, we sort of basically say, let's stop the discussion here. We know the answer. It's sort of also, there's an air of arrogance, isn't it, when we can explain things, when we can label things. And I think as communicators, we just need to be careful we don't convey that sense of arrogance that we know the answer and you didn't, but aha, we've just told you that. And also, the moment we start labelling things and categorising stuff, it sort of says that our science is fixed and it's not changing. And actually, we know the reality that science does change and it evolves as well. So just be a little bit careful into rushing into explaining things straight away, because sometimes we can rob that magicalness, and we can rob our audience's power as well of sort of relishing in the details. So in my work, I try not to give the answer, nor do I try and give the answers. For me, and increasingly, what I'm about is this. It's about highlighting the connections between things. So for me, the second point I really want to share with you is this. It's all about connections, not answers. So connections, not answers. If we can convey that, we can let the audience go on their own adventures. So you've got the mystery hooking them in, and then you've got the adventure of their own discoveries, which leads me into my third point. I don't know if you've ever looked at a match or a candle. Did you notice that there's no shadow with it? That's curious, isn't it? That flame doesn't have a shadow. This is my favourite number, 6210001000. Let me explain why. How many zeros can you see on the screen? 6. And how many ones? 2. And how many 2s? No 3s, no 4s, no 5s, 1, 6, no 7, 8 or 9. So let's see, we've got 6 zeros, 2 1s, 1 2, no 3s, no 4s, no 5, 1 6, no 7s, 8s or 9s. It's an autobiographical number. It describes itself, and it just puts a massive smile on my face. A bit like this. Some of us are familiar with the number pi, 3.14. Do you know what happens if you put the number 3.14 in a mirror? You get the word pi. Absolutely no reason why that works, it just does. And so for me, I love moments like this. I love relishing them, and I love that moment of discovery in my audiences when they just discover something and maybe have those what-if questions percolating in their heads. Magicians can evoke lots of different reactions. So some magicians, they basically look at me, they completely dominate the trick. So what I'm trying to convey here in this diagram, you've got the audience on the left, you've got this big over-the-top magician there, and it totally overshadows the trick, the illusion. But then you can get it the other way. You can end up with a trick or illusion that's so amazing, it completely overshadows the magician and what the magician wants to convey through their art. And effectively, it could be a robot doing the illusion. And to be honest, some illusionists would be better off if they were robots. So for me, there's a third way of doing this. It's about being in parallel with your audience. It's about sort of taking them and together viewing something amazing, something curious. Well, we have that phrase, don't we? Show, don't tell. Actually, I want to extend it further. So my third point is this: guide, don't show. Take our audience, be a tour guide, take them on an adventure, but let them do some of the discovery themselves. So you empower them and you pique their interest. So that's really what I wanted to share with you. So for me, this sort of diagram sort of sums it up. The 3 points I just really wanted to almost prompt our thinking with. Embrace mysteries. Don't be too quick to go to an explanation. And when you get to an explanation, just hold it lightly. Think about connections, not about giving the one answer. And then guide your audiences. Don't show, don't tell. And two big questions to come out of this is, what else? When they see something, you want them thinking, what else could it be? And what if? If my audiences come away thinking, what else and what if, I think that's a success in my book. So I just want to finish with just one little... I'm working on a project, actually. I call it Words on Wonder. And basically, I've interviewed a host of magicians, scientists, creatives, all about how they view wonder, their creative process and curiosity. There's currently 28 interviews. There's going to be a lot more. We've got astronauts lined up. We've got Nobel Prize winners lined up. So if you want to have a look and join in the discussion and see how they view things, Words on Wonder. So that's it from what I want to share. I look forward to your questions later. Cheers.
Fantastic. Well, I think there's a lot of connections actually between what you said, but I'm keen to see if there's any questions or comments from Matt first before we bring our whole panel back together. Good. Nailed it completely. Okay.
Yeah, really resonate with me, because I think sometimes, as I mentioned before, a lot of my conservation
of your presentations back together, I think one of the key things I was writing down was there seems to be this thread of imagination and discovery, and something that's sort of an artistic process in all the things that you're thinking and talking about. So I just wondered if you could maybe just, if we could go through and get your thoughts on that, how important that our audience is sort of discovering the story for themselves or putting their imagination in the mix. Sid, I'm going to hand back to you first.
Is it, I think,
Share.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll relate back to Kin a little bit. So we started trying to spark people's imaginations by these cryptic posters that were appearing around the city of Bristol and flyers, just to, we were trying to get across the concept of what Kin was. So we were putting stuff like animal, vegetable, mineral, indigenous, colonised, Kardashian. So all these like quite sort of cryptic questions, just to stir the beginnings of a story or a debate, and using very sort of creative means. So, you know, in everything that I do, creativity is at the heart of the sort of beginning of whatever marketing or sort of communications campaign.
I think that the key part of, there is definitely a gap between the material produced in the workshops and the audience. And I suppose I would just say that that is the same space that any artist crosses to his or her audience, and the audience has to do the work to inhabit the space that the artist has created. I think, I suppose. I mean, also, there is another point, which is the way that the women interpret their experiences creatively and imaginatively, which is something that takes place during the workshops themselves.
I think there's an art to almost staying one step ahead of your audience, in that you don't want to rush too far ahead and leave them behind or baffle them or something, but you almost want to be, like I said, that guide, sort of coaxing them on and sort of almost dropping little breadcrumbs for them to follow, and they sort of feel like they've discovered themselves. I think some of the best storytellers for that are filmmakers. You watch some of the, like, I'm just thinking, partly as a magician, but I think one of the best films for that is the film Prestige, which is, you just watch the last 5 minutes of the Prestige, and it's just a masterclass in tying together lots of loose ends and taking an audience on a journey, and then pulling the rug from them and then taking them on another journey, and then you sort of question everything. And so I would just encourage you, just look at different filmmakers' techniques for drawing people in, drawing their imagination in, and getting them involved in the process.
Keen to throw it back to the audience of how much do you think we jump to the kind of how when it comes to environmental communications? So we'll take a point if anyone has a thought on that.
It's just a point of discovery. I think when people are, if we're looking at people going on to take action after like learning, taking things from the narrative, I think discovery embeds a lot more sort of memory and in someone's life. They feel like they arrive there themselves rather than being like told a story. So it's like shared participation. I saw the theme in all of them. It's like you as the storyteller, you're placing yourself on the same level as the audience. And it's sort of this like shared experience, and I think they build a lot of trust around that.
I'm keen to pick up a comment I think Leila made about ethics and consent in storytelling. And it's something we've touched on at Communicate before, that if we're in the business of telling stories in order to change people's behaviour, do we need to be thinking more about ethics and consent? Are we tricking people into thinking something or behaving in a certain way? I'm just wondering if any of the panelists had a thought on that.
I think there's ethics in the production of the work, that's one thing, and then there's the ethics that exist between the communication and its audience. And the work that we do is very much, you could think of it as being very directly manipulative of people's emotions. So, you know, that's always something that we have to think about. How far do we want to go down that road? And that's just a point. That's something I definitely think about, but I also think it's nothing to be ashamed of, because if you appeal directly to people's empathy and their emotions, then you're just appealing on a human level. I'm not really sure, actually, about the ethics of this. I think it's something that we all do all the time in our daily interactions, and this kind of communication just takes the intimacy of those interactions into a more public arena.
Can I just come back on that? That empathy point is fascinating, because there's a conservative, Ben Shapiro is a conservative American speaker, and he was saying that empathy is a bad thing, essentially. He says you don't want to empathise, you've got to kind of lead people, and that means not being empathetic. And my first reaction to that was, oh, you poor thing, Mr. Shapiro, if you can't feel empathy, that's a terrible thing. But also, there is something in there about actually the evidence that we need to have before we do take people, because there are some people who aren't led by empathy. In fact, they'll just call you a snowflake, for instance, for trying to do that. And so you have to communicate to them in a different way. And I'm not quite sure how you get around that, but that is the sort of, that's the block you're getting as soon as you try the empathy-sympathy card. And I haven't quite, I'm trying to work my way around it, and I haven't. But it'd be interesting to see if the panel have got a, you know, how do you deal with, you're just a load of snowflakes? Because that's what you're facing from the Conservatives.
Are you asking me that question?
Well, all of you really. It's a panel question. I mean, all of us really. We're all facing the same problem.
Yeah. I've never had that reaction, and to the work that people have complained about. You know, stop playing on our sensitivities, because I think the subject matter itself is so profound and important, you know, that it just doesn't provoke that kind of reaction. And I know Ben Shapiro, I've been actually reading lately about empathy and considering, you know, the limitations of it. I believe that what he's arguing is that decisions made from emotion and empathy are less ethical than those based on evidence and facts. I believe so. So, you know, if we look at what Voice of Freedom is doing in that light, you could say it sort of has no solid ground, really. It's extremely subjective, but that is the intention of the work itself, and it just doesn't pretend to be otherwise.
I think, partly just your comment.
Might just around here and then we'll pass back.
Partly my interest in the magic world is leads me to behavioural economics, which is a fascinating field, and the idea of nudging and choice engineering. And Richard Leila, who sort of started this off, he has this idea of, I think he calls it paternal liberalism, is idea that everyone has the freedom to make choices, but they need steering and guiding a bit like a sort of parent. And so the way you can set things up in terms of the questions and the choices you give people can steer people while still respecting their freedom to make choices. So it's worth, the classic sort of W.H. Smith's bookseller example of that is a book just called Nudge. So if you just want to get into that, sort of talks about some of the techniques for just steering people, making good choices while free choices.
I suppose I'd go one step further with a festival environment. You've got basically a captive audience. Obviously, we don't keep them prisoner, but I call ourselves benevolent dictators, because we can choose what happens in those 4 days in that environment. And so, you know, call it manipulative or call it good leadership, but we make those choices, especially environmental choices, as easy as possible in that environment. And then we could show, actually, to make a change in your everyday life could be that easy if governments or, you know, the leaders that are there when you come home, make those same choices. So it is possible, but we can control that in our environment.
There's a comment there.
Just to go back to your first question, Savita, before the panel, it looks like they're all facilitating something. So Sid facilitates me, I go to Shambhala every year, and we get involved, like about starting now, or even starting a little while ago, in what the themes are. And it's like a co-creation. And the art is a co-creation as well. And there's this creative learning, a facilitated learning, bringing people just so far, letting them make that leap. And that's what I do as well. In getting the public together, doing on really difficult science issues where ethics are really key to it, really fundamental. Some things that are incredibly difficult to make decisions about. And the public come, and there's something to do with honouring them. It's respectful. So we give them really good information, access to the best brains, and then they are brilliant. It doesn't matter what they read or what their background is in responding, and that is a heartfelt response, as well as all the logic and all of the data that they just got. It is a feeling thing, and quite often, there are tears and people learn things, and it's not exactly designed to teach the public anything. It's designed more as an extractive thing to see what they think about this policy. But recently I did something where I followed up 7 years later to see what had happened in the people's lives, and they had all changed. The people that I followed, that I found, they'd all really changed who they were and what they did. They're incredible. And so it really does land with them, that kind of learning. And so, these longitudinal studies, if you can afford them, if you can do it, find out what's happening. You probably run this in your house.
I think the word, when you were just saying that, I was just in my head is just thinking curator, and that's
Exactly.
what I often
Yeah.
describe myself really. In the best terms, it's almost become a cliche nowadays, but I think all of this in some ways, we curate and we take the best, or we take some provocative ideas and throw it into the mix, and then people run with it.
Now, what you can say actually really resonated with, so I do a lot of policy work and a lot of campaigns based on trying to change legislation and responding to consultations and things like that with the government. And how that sort of traditionally runs with most NGOs is that you would have a response that you've written that you ask then your members or members of the public to sign up to then forward on to DEFRA or whoever it is. But, as we know from being a policy person, those responses are then grouped together as an individual response because it's the same thing that's being said over and over and over again. But if we were to take more of an approach, like you were saying about, rather than giving people the answer, giving them what to send, giving them the materials and the opportunity to produce their own answer, to actually find that information in a different way, it would make a lot of campaigning that we do in the consultation responses and things like that we do much more impactful, I think, because you're having a more engaged, informed response to that sort of environmental conversation. So I can already see sort of applications on that sort of, taking people around the answers rather than giving them the answers to that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think in some ways what you could also do is you do a lot of the legwork and the research, and you just place it in front of them, and then they make the choices off the back of that, again acting like a curator of that, and because it's then their decision, as we sort of said earlier, they feel engaged in that, and that's something, once they've made a choice themselves, rather than having it forced on them, they're more likely to go with it and stick with it for the long term as well.
And if you find a way to do something different this year, come back and tell us about it next year. Sure. Is there a hand at the back?
I'm just interested in whether you think creativity or effective storytelling is a skill that you can develop, or whether it's a talent innate in how you think and you can't actually read it. So just like the panel's thoughts on that, and perhaps if it is something that you can help create, what are the conditions to create creativity that we can perhaps use ourselves as communicators?
I mean, I don't think schools are the best places to foster creativity in England. So, I I mean, I was lucky, I was always drawn to art, so I went through art college and did an art degree and stuff, and I think that's really helped me with the way I visualise stuff and way I put together words and copy and comms. Is it something that you can learn? I'm sure it is. I think, you know, people are pigeonholed into what they're good at a very early age, and that's not, you know, necessarily a good thing, because people should be a lot more experimental about the different sort of skills and stuff that they can develop. So.
I would almost say we unlearn it through environment and experience. And I think one of the best ways we can foster creativity is just creating environments that are safe to make mistakes and get things wrong. And we vilify failure, and it's sort of linked, and when something goes wrong, it's whose fault is it? And it becomes a personal thing. Whereas if we actually have spaces where we can throw out ideas and try things and play, do serious play, without the consequences, I think we'll see a lot more creativity around us.
I think that storytelling is innate, and I've been amazed by the women that I work with, some of whom had never picked up cameras before, had never been given any forum to express anything about their lives externally in this way, and how brilliantly they did. So maybe it is a question of the impediments to that and all of the layers that we put on top of our kind of, it's like our DNA is to tell our stories. And I also think, because I'm a writer, so I've written a book of stories as well, and I had complete freedom to write however I wanted, and my way of telling stories is different to many other people's. So we also have to have the liberty to express ourselves in the way that comes the most organically to us. So I suppose you need to have space for that, and a lack of imposition, external imposition.
I'm quite interested in the idea of using photos to tell a story, but my question is, how do you maintain control over that photo, over that message, over that story, and make sure people don't misinterpret it? So a good example that comes to my mind is the palm oil industry. We see orangutans everywhere, and instantly the message people take away is palm oil's bad, therefore I shouldn't use it. Whereas actually, really, that picture should be differentiating between non-sustainable and sustainable palm oil. Now that was almost too powerful, and it's gone out of control, and it's now very hard for people in the palm oil industry to actually be promoting sustainable palm oil. So how do you maintain control over that medium of telling a story?
I think that you might be just talking about a different kind of image use and image production than the ones that Voice of Freedom does, because that sounds like a much more directed and controlled message that you want to send out. Whereas I would say that we don't try to keep control over the stories. We don't control their creation. The authors control their creation. And once they've been created, they're finished objects, if you like, that just go out in the world and people react to them as they wish. So I just think there's something inherently suspect about the idea of trying to control what happens to a story once it's been created. Sorry.
So I'm keen to give you just a bit of wrap-up information, because we're rapidly approaching the end of our session and the end of the day. And I will just tell you all now, and then I'm going to ask to come back to each for just a quick word on some of the things that you've talked about, either a website or the best place to find out about PIN or other things coming up, where to find out more about Voice of Freedom, and remind us the website for Words of Wonder or other things. So you guys are ready to do that. But we're just coming up to our last bits of today. So our next session is upstairs in the lecture theatre. We've got James Honeyborn from Blue Planet. But if you'd like to take an hour before the drinks reception, which is in here at 5 o'clock, you can also visit the zoo for the last hour that it's open. Just make sure you're back here for 5 o'clock, so you've got a bit of a choice there. Okay, I'm going to hand the microphone back for just get your pens at the ready for website details and other things. To find find out more about these projects?
So if anyone is interested in coming to Kin in a few weeks, go to kin.world. The programme's quite bewildering. A lot of people can't quite get their heads around it, which is sort of a good thing, but it's also quite a bad thing. And I can offer a promo code now. It's We Are All Kin, uppercase, and put that into the promo box of the ticket page, and you'll get some really good cheap tickets.
Voice of Freedom is at voiceoffreedom.org.
If you want to find me online, probably the best place is Twitter. It's just Science Magician. And that interview series I mentioned, it's wordsonwonder.com. Wordsonwonder.com.
Fantastic. Can we finish with a huge round of applause for our panel?